Hello, and I hope you're doing great today. It's a joy, it's a delight, it's a pleasure, it's a privilege to be with you for yet another edition of Roadmap to Organizational Strategy on Amogate Radio Communications this first Tuesday of the beautiful month of August. My name is Tolu Omonera, and you're very welcome to the program. This is the fourth edition of this program. It's been very interesting, it's been very illuminating, it's been very engaging, and we are very glad for the privilege of your presence. We'll continue to say you are the reason why we do this. If we put all of this together and do the research and do the analysis and put our thoughts together and structure them together and you are not here, it's all going to be a waste. So we're very glad for the privilege of the presence, and we want to ask you to please continue to share the word, invite your friends, invite your colleague. Believe me, it will be worth every minute of your time. So, as always, we are going to begin by doing a quick recap of last week's episode, right? Either for those of us who were here with us last week, who would find it beneficial and valuable to be reminded of some of the highlights, or for those who are joining us and who were not able to be here, whichever bracket you fall into, you're going to find it helpful for us to be doing this recap of some of the last week's highlights, right? So, what are some of the main things we looked at last week? One, strategy must be responsive. Very, very important. Strategy must be responsive. We do not stand in one place in strategy. I repeat, we do not stand in one place with strategy. Why? Because the environment you're strategizing for, whether you're in the public sector, or you're in the private sector, or you're in the non-profit sector, the environment you're strategizing for is continuously evolving. We gave several examples last week, right? And on the global scene, we talked about factors like the Ukraine war, Israel-Gaza war, and so many other factors, the reduction in dollarization as Russia's strategic response to the bans they've experienced from the West, and so many factors that could have significantly altered the environment of your business. We came down to the Nigerian environment too, for those of us who may be based in Nigeria or impacted by what happens in Nigeria significantly. We talked about factors, for instance, like the foreign exchange instability, right? Extreme instability. If you ask me, how the naira, for instance, has more or less been devalued in 300-fold, in 300%, beg your pardon, right? In threefold. So the naira that was exchanging for about $500, for the naira that was exchanging for about $500 to $1, just less than 2 years ago, before the previous administration handed over to the current administration, is suddenly exchanging at about 1,500 naira to a single dollar. Now, that can be a plus for you, and it can also be a minus for you. For many, it can be a minus, especially if they are importing or they are heavily dependent, for instance, on foreign exchange or dynamics, right? And if they need to do a lot and pay for a lot in the US dollar. Of course, on the other hand, it can also be a plus for you if you made an investment, for instance, in the United States when the naira was, let's say, 500 to $1, and you are having to sell in the United States, and you're now having to bring back those funds to Nigeria for further investment. All of a sudden, you may be making three times what you made in terms of naira. So it depends on which side you may be on. It can be a plus and it can be a minus. What is important to know is that the change in market dynamic is going to impact your environment of operations. And so your strategy cannot be static. I've said all this to emphasize that point we made last week. One of the highlights of last week is that strategy must be responsive. We do not stand in one place with strategy. Why? Because the environment we are strategizing for is also on the move. And if I may add, sometimes on the constant move, right? So we also said last week that making strategic choices in view of your internal and external environment assessment is important. I repeat, making strategic choices, take note of the word choices, in view of the internal and external environmental assessment insight is very, very important. Like, so what I mean by that. Last week, we ended up talking about strategic prioritization and strategic discrimination. And we said that we are going to, kind of speak more to that in subsequent weeks, beginning this week, hopefully. Now, every time you are making a strategy, you are trying to decide which way to go. I repeat, every time you're making a strategy, you're trying to decide which path to take, right? And that's why we said it's like trying to shine a light in a maze, right? In a dark maze, for instance, if I may further qualify that maze. Now, a maze by itself is like a complicated twist, right? When you're in the middle of a maze, you're trying to figure your way out. And what strategy is supposed to do is that it's supposed to shine that light in the middle of the maze, right? One of the dictionary definitions of a maze is a network of paths and hedges designed as a puzzle through which one has to find a way. I repeat, a network of paths and edges designed as a puzzle is that it's supposed to be, entangled. It's supposed to be something you have to untangle, and you're supposed to find a way. So that strategy is supposed to be the way through the maze. It's supposed to shine the light. Now, you cannot find a way until you articulate your destination. That's one of the things we are going to be emphasizing this week. Now, when it comes to strategic prioritization and strategic discrimination, it's about choices because there can be more than one way through that maze. There can be more than one way to your destination. Very, very, very important. And so when you're confronted with choices, you have to find the one that aligns mostly with your internal strengths, that helps you consolidate on your internal strengths, and also helps you navigate around your internal weaknesses most effectively. I'll say that again. When you're trying to determine a strategy, when you're trying to make a strategic choices, because there will be strategic options. If you have done a good job, and we're going to talk about that today, there will be strategic options, right? Now, when you're making your strategic choice, as much as possible, you should be choosing the strategy that helps you consolidate the most on your internal strengths and helps you navigate around your internal weaknesses most effectively, especially in view of current market realities. That's the external aspect of it, right? What are current market realities? What are current regulatory factors? What are even current political ongoings, right? All of these things should inform the strategic choice you eventually make. So that was one of the things we said last week, right? Strategic prioritization, and we ended on a note of strategic discrimination, right? Anytime you're prioritizing, it suggests that you are discriminating. If I'm prioritizing a certain pathway through the maze, and I must be discriminating against another pathway. We may not have the time to dwell much on the issue of strategic discrimination this week, but believe me, it's something we will have to still speak more to before this program is over. Many times as leaders, sometimes we are involved in too many things, and that is not strategic. You must be bold enough and courageous enough as a leader to do a lot of strategic discrimination. My colleague Jayoba Adepeju has been taking us through a fantastic program which airs every Monday on ARC. The program is on leadership competencies, right, and organizational behavior. The organizational behavior she has been emphasizing will derive a lot from your own leadership strengths. And one of the strengths I believe she has already talked about in the previous episode is courage. It's a critical leadership competence. As a leader, you must be courageous enough to make appropriate strategic discriminations. In our work of over a decade and a half with many organizations, and I'm saying this with every sense of credibility, from private sector to public sector and non-profit sector, sometimes it is almost disheartening to see insufficient leadership courage. Because if you as a leader cannot make that decision with courage, how then would people be able to carry on? You must not be afraid to make strategic discrimination in order to be able to make or ensure strategic prioritization. So that's what we emphasized last week, strategic prioritization, and towards the end we mentioned strategic discrimination. And last but probably not the least, for the sake of time, we talked about strategy being a highly creative process. I repeat, a highly creative process. A strategy is supposed to be highly responsive, and in responding, you must be creative. Please listen. In responding, you must be creative. I think 2 weeks ago we talked about the fact that if you are, doing what you're doing, if you're doing exactly what others are doing in the market, precisely the same way others are doing it, you don't have a strategy. I repeat, if you're doing exactly what others are doing, precisely the same way others are doing it, then you don't have a strategy. A strategy is supposed to be highly creative. Why? Because your specific composition of strengths and weaknesses is very likely to be unique to you. this is one of the things we said last week, right? So if the unique composition of strengths and weaknesses is peculiar to you, right, then the way you are responding to the broad array of opportunities and threats in your industry also has to be unique, because it has to be uniquely crafted to your own strengths and weaknesses. So your strategy is supposed to be responding to external environments, but also responding based on your internal strengths and weaknesses. Very, very, very important. So it's critical that you carry out the evaluations, the assessment, because for every strategy you create, there are certain underlying assumptions which may have shifted significantly. This was one of the points we made last week, and this is why strategy must be a highly creative process, and that creativity is not one-off. You must be continuously creating based on the shifting market occurrences, right? So all in all, your strategy should be a light bulb that inspires action and guides decision making. We said that it should be a light bulb that inspires action, because you're shining a light on that darkness, you're shining a light through the maze, and you're also guiding decision making, because when your strategic direction is very clear, when your organization is faced with multiple choices or even only two choices, your strategy will guide decision making and help you know which to prioritize and which to discriminate against. Very, 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 very important, right? Because many times you cannot do everything simultaneously and do them effectively. I repeat, many times you cannot be doing everything simultaneously and be doing them effectively. Many, many times we sacrifice effectiveness, we sacrifice the opportunity to consolidate on our strengths on the altar of unnecessary multiplicity. Right? There is a beneficial multiplicity, and there is the multiplicity that can be highly unbeneficial because we are spread in so many directions, hence the need for strategic discrimination and prioritization. Well, this is still Tolong and I'm going to get ready communications. We are looking at roadmaps to organizational strategy this beautiful first Tuesday of the month of August 6, 2024. It's a joy, it's a delight, it's a pleasure, it's a privilege to have you with us, and we're going deeper into the stream. We'll be back shortly. So, what are we looking at this week? The thrust of today's episode is the how of strategy. The how of strategy. The last 2 weeks I've looked at the what of strategy. What is strategy, right? What exactly do we mean when we mention strategy, and what are some of the benefits of doing strategy? These are some of the things we've been looking at in the last 2 weeks. What is strategy and what are the benefits of having an organizational strategy? Today, we'll be looking at the how of strategy, right? What are the dynamics and nuances of strategy development? I repeat, what are the strategies and nuances of strategy development? And this takes us back to our DIME cycle, which is Amogate's unique strategic management framework. D standing for development, I standing for implementation, M standing for monitoring, and the E standing for evaluation. Of course, all of this leads to the R, which is reinvention, right? So there's an extension of the DIME, which could give you the DIMA cycle, but the core of it is the DIME cycle, which is strategy development, implementation, monitoring, and then evaluation, right? So when it comes to the how strategy, there are certain things I want us to please take note of and walk away with. One, strategy begins with goal setting. Strategy begins with goal setting, which flows, of course, from the vision. Remember, strategy is supposed to be helping you to know where to go. I kind of alluded to this a few minutes ago. Now, if you do not know exactly where you are going, how do you know the best way to get there? Even with your map. If you have a map and you're trying to get a direction, which is what strategy is, the map is going to request a destination before there can be a direction, right? How can you have a direction if you don't have a destination? Many times we are like that. We don't have a strategic clarity, and then we are trying to have strategic direction. It doesn't happen that way, right? The strategy begins as a matter of compulsion with goal setting, and the goals must flow from the vision. That is why we will keep talking about leadership in Amogate, and that's why leadership remains very important to us. That clarity of vision begins with the leadership. Leadership must create a clear and compelling vision, the direction, the goals, and it's after that that you can now be talking about the possible strategies of arriving at that destination, that vision, and those goals. So very, very important. What you are setting your strategy for are your goals. Every time you hear strategy, it is because there are goals to be achieved. It is those goals you're trying to achieve that you now try to create strategies for. Because I know where I'm trying to go, I'm now trying to determine the best way of getting there. So there must be strategic clarity, right? That's why in Amogate we emphasize strategic clarity a lot. Many times, I remember something we wrote once. We said in many times in organization, the how of what we are doing has come to replace the what. I repeat, many times in organization, the how of what we're doing has come to replace the what. And if you don't have clarity on the what, when the how has come to replace the what, then you can't get creative with the how. Let me break that down. So if I am trying to get to destination A and I've made up my mind that the only path is, for instance, to take a bus, right? I will not be able to explore other options like a train. I won't be able to explore other options like even riding a bike. I may not be able to explore other options, for instance, like taking a trolley, and so on and so forth. All because I have confused the how with the what. The goal is not the path. The goal is right on the path. And especially when we have done some things repeatedly, and because we appear to have done them effectively over a long period of time, we confuse the how with the what, and then we can't get creative with the how. And so many times, if you're not careful, we don't find more efficient ways of doing things, we don't find more innovative ways of doing things, we don't find more responsive ways of doing things, all because our how has replaced our what. No, strategy begins with clarity of goals, extremely important. What you are trying to do must be extremely clear from how you're trying to do it. And every time you sit down to have a strategic process, every time either we are teaching organizational strategy in nations, in organizations, or anytime we are facilitating strategic planning retreats and Amogate, which we've been doing for over a decade, we always begin with that clarity. What exactly are you trying to achieve? And I don't want to tell you the number of times we have seen that there is a confusion between the what and the how, and we have to guide the organization's leadership to say, no, this is not essentially your what. Let's unlayer it, right? Let's have some strategic unlayering here to get to the root of your organizational intent. Very important. What exactly is your organizational intent, your strategic intent? When you know what you are driving at and you untangle it, right? You separate the what from the how, and it becomes easier to get creative with the how. I hope this is not sounding unnecessarily complex. I'm really trying my best to break it down. But remember, we had already warned that strategy can be a very conceptual exercise. I remember saying this about 2-3 episodes ago, but we'll keep going as methodically as possible, right? So again, the first point I'm making is that strategy begins with goal setting. Once you are setting your strategy, you have to ask yourself, what exactly are we trying to achieve? Strategy development begins with goals clarity. Very important, right? And that's why we emphasize strategic clarity a lot at Amogate. What you're trying to achieve must not be replaced by how you're trying to achieve it. Otherwise, you will get stuck on a particular how, and you will no longer be creative or innovative or responsive to changing market dynamics or even the public sector ongoing realities. Now, let's go to another point with the strategy. Having laid that foundation for strategic clarity, another thing you have to know is that you have to understand that there can be more than one way of arriving at your destination. As a matter of fact, many times there would be more than one way of arriving at your destination. Now, when you're very clear about that destination, it's now easy to kind of narrow down on the possible ways, the possible strategies. The whole process of strategizing has to do with discriminating against some of those ways and prioritizing some of those ways. But the first thing is to even articulate the possible ways of arriving at your destination. I repeat, once you are clear about your goals, right, you must be able to evaluate, you must be able to assess, you must be able to articulate possible directions that can lead to your destination. Your destination should be, as much as possible, wholesome. It should be one clear destination. There can be subsets and so on and so forth, but there must be a concise and comprehensive goal that you're driving at, especially at the organizational level. This will be broken down, of course, at the departmental and unit levels and so on and so forth. But at the organizational level, there must be goals, clarity, and conciseness and comprehensiveness. And then you can now be able to say what are the possible strategies of arriving at this goal. And those strategies should be multiple. Many times there should be. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, I do not know an effective strategy process that would give you only one way. If all you have is one way of arriving at your goal, I will question that strategy process. Every time we facilitate strategic planning retreat, we always compel the creation of several alternative routes. Very important. And why is it important to have several alternative routes? Because each route will have its strengths and weaknesses. And this brings us to another point of the how of strategy. Once you are looking into the strategies, the possible strategies, you've not narrowed down on any, you're just exploring. When you're having defined your destination, you're now looking at possible directions. You're simply looking at this at least 3 or 4. Right, as much as possible, we would kind of guide organizations when we are facilitating their strategy retreats or strategic planning processes. We'll guide them to narrow down on 3 or 4. Now, this is a very inclusive process. I don't want to go into the nuances of that in this episode, but you can trust me, a lot should have gone ahead with this. We talked about environmental assessment a lot last week, very important. We should have carried out political assessment, economic assessment, environmental assessment, labor assessment. The 7 dimensions to have looked at before narrowing down on the possible directions, right? We emphasized this environmental assessment issue a lot last week, and so we may not really dwell on it this week. But having done all of this assessment, read all the reports, sometimes you have to read, for instance, what's IMF saying, what's World Bank saying about the countries in which you're operating, especially if you're a multinational. Let's say there are certain key countries that X percentage, a significant percentage of your profits come from. You really want to look at what are the assessments, the economic stability of that country, the political stability of that country could significantly impact your output. Very important, right? Ditto for Asian development banks, because sometimes you also want to get the balance view. If you ask me, most times you should endeavor to get a balance view. You don't just want to know what World Bank is saying or what IMF is saying. You also want to look at what the Asian Development Bank is saying. You want to look at the perspective, for instance, of the Chinese, and so on and so forth, right? That's what we would strongly recommend. Get a very holistic and balanced view. There's also the African Development Bank, the AFDB. What are they also saying, right? You want to look at very a multinational, a multi-sectoral perspective, right? When I say multi-sectoral, yes, what are the regulatory institutions that could impact what you do in your organization? If you're a private sector organization, what kind of regulatory frameworks could significantly affect what you do, either for good or otherwise, right? And then how do you want to mitigate against those possible threats? Again, we don't have a lot of time to go into that this week. We're going to go deeper into that. But threat, opportunities, and threat assessment is something you really want to do. We highlighted it last week in the SWOT framework, which we shared. That's not our framework. That's a proven strategy framework, especially for the external and internal environmental assessment. And it's something we recommend. Strengths, S standing for your strengths, W standing for your weaknesses. Those are typically internal, O standing for opportunities, and T standing for threats, and those are largely external. Very important. So when you have carried out all of those internal and external assessments, that's when you can begin to say, okay, based on all of this assessment, empirical, take note, extremely important, empirical, evidence-based, very important, right? What was the statistics supporting it? What's the data? You want to look at the trends analysis. I would not suggest you look at anything less than 3 to 5 years trends, as well as 3 to 5 years projections, both back and forth. You can't just look at the trends analysis. You also should be looking at the projections. Of course, this, especially for the projections, the future focused data can be very dynamic, so you will keep reviewing and updating, like we've kept emphasizing. But you also want to look at the trends, because many times even the future is informed by the past. Many times the projections of the future are significantly impacted by the analysis of past trends. This is still Amoge Radio Communications with Tolu Madara. Today we are beginning to look into the how of strategy formulation, having looked at the what of strategy in the last 2 episodes. Today we are now looking at the how of strategy, the dynamics/nuances of strategy development, right? We've looked at the fact that strategy begins with goal setting. Very, very important. You are setting strategy for your goals, right? We've also talked about the need for clarity of goals, extremely important. You need to have a very clear sense of where you're going before you can look at how to get there. Now we are making the points that as much as possible, you should have more than one possible strategy before you decide on which would be the one you are prioritizing. Very, very important, right? Before you talk about strategic prioritization and strategic discrimination, there definitely must be strategic options, right? It's because there are strategic options that you know which ones you want to discriminate against and which ones you want to prioritize, right? So there must be strategic options, and those strategic options should be informed by the environmental assessment, right? And then having made all of those assessments, internal, external trends, projections, and so on and so forth, you then begin to, go into some strategic, you then begin to craft some strategic options, right, which you will now narrow down on. After doing some discrimination, you can then do some prioritization. I really don't know how much further we can go today. I'm a little bit hesitant to go into another depth because we will soon be coming to the end of our time. But let me just drop something there that we would continue on next week by God's grace, right? And that is the fact that when you are, whatever you decide upon eventually, right? Whatever you decide upon eventually, it must be evidence-based, very, very important. It must be continuously reviewed, very, very important, in view of, ongoing realities. Very, very, very important. Whatever you decide upon, I've alluded to it, but I'm also emphasizing it. It must be evidence-based, it must be continuously reviewed, and it must be made in view of current market evolutions, because the market you are operating in is currently evolving, right? Even the political environment you're operating in is continuously changing, right? The global dynamics, right, that you are sandwiched between are not static, right? So because of all of this, it's really important that as you craft your strategy, it must be evidence-based, and the data, the evidence, the statistics that you're using is very important to ensure that these are continuously reviewed. Extremely important. So what do you do with all of this evidence and so on and so forth? It's very important that in creating a strategy, you are mindful of the threats in the environment. Very, very important. And I think that's the note on which I want to close. Because once you have that vision or your goals, the road or the path from the creation of your vision to the actualization of your vision is not going to be without challenges. You can take that to the bank. I repeat, the road or the path from the articulation of your vision to the actualization of your vision is not going to be without sometimes an array of barriers, not just one challenge, but sometimes simultaneous challenges. And this could range, like I've hinted at, it could be regulatory, it could be economic, it could be political, right? And that's why whenever you're creating your strategy, much as I've said, you want to narrow down on your strategic options, you also want to make sure that you have some strategic alternatives. Very, very, very important. And those alternatives must be created vis-a-vis what you might want to call some forecast models, right? In other words, so let me go back to the issue of Naira dollar exchange rate in Nigeria. So let's say you had created a strategy, and when you created a strategy, the Naira was about 500 to $1, right? If you had created your strategy effectively, especially if you're an organization that is heavily dependent and your outcomes could be very heavily dependent on the foreign exchange rates, you should have also crafted some strategic alternatives saying, should the Naira become, for instance, 750 to $1, this would be our alternative. This would be our strategic response. It's like building a house and not having a fire escape route, right? That's what it means to create a strategy and not anticipate those threats. That's what framework I think is an effective one. Much as you want to identify your opportunities, you also want to be realistic with your threats. I have never seen a path from visual articulation to visual actualization that will not, run into challenges. It's just a fact of life. And so when you are creating your strategy, right, for those goals after having your strategic clarity, and much as you also want to have strategic options that will be narrowed down to some priorities and some that you discriminate against, you also want to have what you may want to call contingency plans, right? So should the environment of operation change in these ways, these are strategic alternatives that will consider should this happen. So you want to forecast different scenarios, right? We call it forecasting. You want to say, okay, let's forecast some possible scenarios. Should, for instance, let me come to the United States, should Trump become president and we have invested X amount in offshore wind, how do we want to cope during his 4 years of presidency? What will be our responses to that? What will be our strategic response to that threat to the industry, right? Or to the emerging offshore wind energy space in the United States? That's just the reality. And I can go on and on, but I think you get the point now, right? So we've talked a lot about goals clarity, strategic clarity. Your strategy is meant for the destination. The destination must be clear. That's where you can articulate possible options. You want to articulate those options after doing a comprehensive and honestly, if possible, an exhaustive analysis of the environment of business. But after doing all that, after narrowing down on your strategic options, you also want to select your strategic priorities. Which one do you want to prioritize and which one do you want to discriminate against? But in between strategic prioritization and strategic discrimination, as much as possible, you also want to have some strategic alternatives, your backup plans or your contingency plans based on certain environments that you must have forecasted. Environment of business or certain climate of business. Should this happen in my environment, in my industry, in the nations where a lot of my profits come from as an organization? What do we want to do, right? What do I want to do? Well, on this note, I think we're going to have to call it a day. Please take your time to review some of the things you have shared. Take your time to digest. Take your time to reflect. Take your time to share. Don't forget, one, you can find this on our MixLR page. We are also going to be updating our YouTube page with it. If you feel the need to go back to reflect, to share this, to listen again, and please don't forget, we have been doing this for about a decade and a half. We've been working with organizations, public sector organizations, private sector organizations, non-profit organizations. We've been working with them to create strategic plans. We've been facilitating strategic planning retreats locally and internationally. We've also been doing a lot of strategic management trainings. Please reach out to us. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can find us on Instagram. You can also check out our website, www.theamogate.org. Please reach out to us. We would really love to work with you. Strategy is what we do, is our strength, is our passion. So do we do leadership development. We also have an array of programs from Monday through Friday. Great, interesting, illuminating and very valuable programs. I come in here for the sake of time. Thank you so much. This has been Tolu Madara. It's been fun doing this with you. I personally look forward to being back with you same time, same station next week, and I hope that you would be doing as much as you can with what you have heard until we meet again. Until then, think strategic prioritization, think strategic discrimination, and also think strategic alternatives. See you next week. Thank you.